A flickering lamp, a timed signal, and a death no one can explain. Welcome to Rust Evidence. I am your host, Silas Wren. I love connecting with listeners worldwide. Drop a comment with where you're watching from. Every message from you adds light to this mystery-loving community. Let's dive in. It is a peculiar truth that electric light, once considered a triumph of rational progress, becomes in certain moods an insidious thing. In the best households it should be constant, cheerfully illuminating needlepoint or ledger, sermon draft or scotch, and never capriciously flicker like a spiritualist's parlor trick. But flicker it did. At 8:30 on the evening of April the 4th, just as Mrs. Hester Croom of East Hatch Grange stood to slice the Stilton. Her knife, silver with a mother-of-pearl handle, halted mid-air. The parlor lights blinked twice, one slow, one sharp, and resumed their steady glow. Mrs. Croom muttered something Protestant and uncomplimentary. Lord Peter Wimsey, seated precisely opposite her, leaned back and watched the Stilton with scholarly interest. Odd, he murmured, that the lamp should flicker exactly as the cheese approached its end. Almost as though the power were protesting the extinction of a noble wedge. Mrs. Croom blinked at him, unused to conversational cheese metaphysics. "I'm sure it's nothing," she said. "This house has always been peculiar about its wiring. My late husband insisted on knobs and tubes and heaven knows what. Vintage charm, he said. Never replaced a thing unless it exploded." "A man of rare restraint," Wimsey replied, taking a sip of something golden and extremely old from a cut-glass tumbler. They were a party of 8 that night, diminished now to 7. One chair, conspicuously set and untouched, remained at the far end of the long oak table. Its occupant, Dr. Charles Martingale, had not come down to dinner. "Unforgivable," said Reverend Tolland, who always spoke as though offering confession on someone else's behalf. To keep one's hostess waiting at table, no matter how pressing one's introspections. "He said he had a headache," Hester offered with a brittle edge. "A man can hardly be blamed for that." "Indeed not," Wimsey said. "Some of the most distinguished criminals in history have suffered from headaches, or possibly caused them." There was a weak attempt at laughter, but Mrs. Croom's face had grown pale in the candle glow, and the Stilton slice now lay forlorn beside the chutney. Across from Wimsey sat Sybil Croom, niece to the hostess, composer of unlistenable symphonic modernism, and currently drinking her wine in a manner that suggested it might be poison. Though she drank it anyway. "What is the matter with this house?" she asked, more to her glass than to the room. "The lights go mad. The clocks tick backwards. My bedroom smells like lilies and pipe smoke, and I haven't the faintest idea why." "My dear," said Hester, with a host's wounded dignity, "if you dislike my home so, how you needn't have accepted my invitation." Wimsey interjected gently, "Oh, do let her dislike the house. Mrs. Croom, disliking things is so often the beginning of truth." "Truth?" said Sybil. "What on earth does that mean?" But she did not get an answer, for at that moment, like the final beat in a symphony scored by an indifferent deity, the butler, Dawson, appeared in the doorway, begging pardon. "Madam," he said, "but Dr. Martingale is not answering. I knocked several times. I even called out. There is no reply. It would not have mattered so much had it not been for the way he said it. Dawson was not the sort to allow emotion into his larynx, but something in his inflection, some ancient and hereditary warning passed down through generations of butlers, brought every knife and fork to rest." Hester stood slowly. "He was unwell. Perhaps he's fallen asleep. Shall I—" Dawson did not finish the sentence. Wimsey rose. "If I may. You see, I have a fondness for unwell men who do not answer knocks, and a professional curiosity regarding flickering lamps. Let us go and disturb the peace." They moved in a quiet group, not so much walking as floating down the red-carpeted corridor. The house, East Hatch Grange, was one of those Georgian affairs with corridors that sulked and staircases that complained. The door to the doctor's guest room was firmly shut. Wimsey rapped it lightly. "Dr. Martingale, I say, awfully sorry to interrupt your migraine, but we're all beginning to take it personally." No response. Wimsey tried the handle. It turned. The door creaked open to reveal a darkened room with one standing lamp glowing beside the escritoire, and there, slumped across the desk, head lolled to one side as though nodding at a disagreeable diagnosis, lay the lifeless figure of Charles Martingale. The room smelled of singed paper and lemon polish. On the floor beneath the doctor's arm was a sheet of thick stationery, bearing a single sentence in a jagged, unfinished scrawl. I should have stopped her, but— "Curious," said Whimsy. "Just curious enough." He looked up at the flickering lamp. It chose that moment, with singular dramatic sense, to go out entirely. The silence that followed the discovery of Dr. Martingale's body was brittle, as though the very walls of Easthatch Grange were holding their breath. Whimsy moved forward without urgency, his gaze flickering across the writing desk, the paper, the unmoving figure. He made no dramatic pronouncements, merely reached to switch the lamp back on unsuccessfully. It remained obstinately dark, as though in mourning or mockery. "Dawson," he said with mild curiosity, "do you happen to know whether this lamp is on the same circuit as the parlour?" "I couldn't say, my lord. The wiring here is—" Dawson trailed off with tactful disapproval, somewhat individual. "Quite. If the light won't return to duty, perhaps you could be persuaded to fetch a torch." Dawson departed silently. In the meantime, Whimsy crouched, sniffed the air with a twitch of the nostrils, and gently lifted one pale, cool hand from where it hung. The doctor's skin had that peculiar slackness that speaks not of sleep but of final withdrawal. No wound was visible, no immediate sign of violence, only the unfinished sentence on the page and a small brown bottle, unlabeled, though not entirely out of place on a physician's desk. Hester hovered in the doorway. "Is he—" "Yes," Whimsy said, standing with a sigh. "He's dead." Sybil let out a sound between a scoff and a gasp. Reverend Tolland crossed himself with theatrical restraint. Hester made a low noise in her throat, like a teakettle regretting its boil. Dawson returned with a torch which Whimsy accepted, angling the beam delicately about the room. The window was latched. The fire had burned low. A teacup rested on the side table, with the faint ring of residue inside. "Did anyone see Dr. Martingale after luncheon?" Whimsy asked. "You said he claimed a headache. Did he remain in his room all afternoon?" "I knocked around 4, Hester said. "He called out rather curtly, I thought, that he was resting and didn't want to be disturbed." "Did you detect any oddity in his voice?" "Only that he sounded irritable, but then Charles always was when suffering." Whimsy nodded, pensive. "I dislike interrupted sentences. They suggest either melodrama or meddling." He leaned closer to the desk again, examining the page. The ink had spattered faintly in a downward droplet, an involuntary tremor at the moment of collapse, or a struggle of some kind. "I should have stopped her, but—" he repeated aloud. "It's the her that gives one pause." "Her who?" Sybil asked from the doorway, arms tightly crossed. "That," Whimsy said with the smallest of smiles, "is the question." He left the room shortly after the arrival of Dr. Weatherby, the local general practitioner, who was summoned by Dawson in solemn haste. Hester excused herself with wan dignity, and Sybil drifted off like a sulky ghost to her bedroom. Only Reverend Tolland remained behind, peering into the darkness with a curate's guilty curiosity. "Strange man, Martingale," the clergyman said when Whimsy found him nursing his port in the drawing-room. "Brilliant, but not exactly warm. Always had a touch of the icy pulpit about him, if you know what I mean." "I don't, but I'll accept the metaphor," Whimsy replied. "Did you know him well?" "Hardly. He and Hester go back years, family friends. He came down from London once or twice a year. She trusted him implicitly, a mistake one makes with professionals far too often." Tolland blinked. "You think it was suicide?" "I think," said Whimsy, carefully selecting a nut from the dish by the fire, "that a man who begins a confession doesn't stop mid-sentence unless someone interrupts. It's a little too pat, don't you think? And more to the point, I don't yet know what her he meant. One must at least meet all the hers before settling on one." The following morning brought drizzle and uncertainty. Whimsy rose early, claiming the back stairs in order to avoid breakfast formalities, and made first for the kitchen. There he encountered the housekeeper, Mrs. Prestwich, stout and wheezy, who was engaged in the eternal struggle of silver polishing. "Begging your pardon, my lord," she said, glancing up as he entered, "but the police said no one was to go into Dr. Martingale's room." "Quite right, Mrs. Prestwich. I'm doing nothing of the kind. I'm merely inquiring as to what the doctor might have eaten or drunk in the hours before his unfortunate expiration." "Well," she said, folding her arms over her vast middle, "he didn't have much. Said he had no appetite and took just a pot of tea around 4. I brought it up myself." Left it on the little table by the door. He didn't let you in? No, sir. Told me to go away. Rudely. Away. Rudely. Away. She pursed her lips. He wasn't a rude man, not usually. Just distracted. Pale as chalk he was. I thought it might be nerves. Did he seem frightened? Her eyes darted, then steadied. No, just hollow, as though something was weighing on him. Did he eat anything else? Touch anything downstairs? Not that I saw. And I'd have seen. Whimsy thanked her, nodded to the cook, and then made his way through the narrow side passage to speak with Dawson, who was meticulously brushing invisible lint from the stair carpet. You've been in the household long, Dawson? 12 years, my lord. And have you ever known the wiring to behave so melodramatically? Dawson sniffed without shifting his gaze. It flickers now and then, especially in poor weather. The circuits are ancient and overlap oddly, but it doesn't usually go out altogether. It did last night. Yes, my lord. I reset the fuse myself after you went up. Do you recall what was running on that circuit? Dawson frowned. Dining room, parlor, and the corridor outside Dr. Martingale's room. Not inside the room itself. Not inside. No, sir. That lamp by the escritoire is on a separate loop entirely. Whimsy's face sharpened. Then why did it go out? I can't say, my lord. But you see the problem? Yes, my lord. He returned upstairs deep in thought. The doctor's room was now sealed under police tape, but the puzzle was unfolding not there, but outside it through wiring, witnesses, and the woman in the note. Whimsy paused at the upstairs landing and looked towards Sybil's door. A faint smell, cigarettes, lilies, and something sharper lingered in the air. He smiled without mirth. Time, perhaps, to make her acquaintance in fuller detail. Lord Peter found Sybil Croom seated on the windowsill of the small morning room, a cigarette curling smoke against the leaded panes. She wore a dressing gown the colour of brandy, and her toes, narrow and pale, peeked from worn velvet slippers. She did not look up as he entered, but blew a plume of smoke toward the greying sky. I was wondering, she said, how long it would take you to come interrogate me. My dear Miss Croom, Whimsy replied, selecting a chair and folding himself into it, with aristocratic grace. You make it sound as though you were expecting a Spanish Inquisition. I assure you I've no thumbscrews on me, unless you count conversational ones. She exhaled through her nose. Isn't that what you do? Turn people's words against them until they snap. Only if they've said something particularly incriminating, he said amiably. Which you haven't, yet a pause laden with irony. She flicked ash into the teacup beside her. I don't suppose you'd care to tell me what your relationship with Dr. Martingale was? He asked gently. He was my aunt's physician, she said flatly, and a sanctimonious bore, but not yours. God, no. I prefer the sort of doctor who lets you drink, smoke, and live out your misery in peace. Admirably modern, said Whimsy. Still, you must have encountered him often. Often enough. He came every spring like mildew. Claimed it was to check on Aunt Hester's blood pressure, but I think he liked the old furniture and the sense of being needed. Did you ever quarrel? She looked at him sharply this time. Her eyes were a cloudy blue like pond water disturbed by a stone. We had words once, she said after a moment. Last year. He found me in the library. He always wondered where he wasn't wanted, and he asked whether I found it easy to live on my aunt's generosity. And what did you say? I said it wasn't generosity if it was dangled like a noose. I think he liked that in a nasty way. He smiled. Whimsy nodded. And this year? No quarrels, she said. But he watched me. Watched? As though he were waiting for something, judging. Did he mention anything unusual? A concern? Secret? She stubbed her cigarette into the saucer and rose with sudden animal energy. No, but he wasn't himself. Not the usual pinched schoolmaster routine. He looked hunted. Hunted by whom? She didn't answer. Whimsy rose as well, slow and deliberate. Did you see him yesterday? After luncheon. I passed him on the landing. He didn't speak. Did you go into his room? No. Her tone was too abrupt, like a trapdoor slamming shut. Whimsy didn't press her further. Instead, he bowed slightly and made for the door. You think he was murdered, she said, before he crossed the threshold. I think, he said without turning, that someone didn't want him to finish his sentence. Downstairs, he found Reverend Tolland loitering in the library. The clergyman looked as though he had tried to read something theological and failed. I say, Tolland said, do you mind awfully if I ask, what do you make of that note? The unfinished one? Yes, I should have stopped her, but It's terribly melodramatic, isn't it? Sounds more like a novel than a real-life suicide note. Precisely, said Whimsy, selecting a worn copy of The Turn of the Screw from the shelf and thumbing it without interest. And not quite in keeping with Dr. Martingale's usual tone, if I'm any judge. You knew him better than I. Not at all. I just read handwriting. Hand's tone is nearly always in the curl of the airs. Tolland blinked at this. You're saying he might have been coerced to write it. Whimsy set the book down gently. Or interrupted while writing it. I never intended it as a suicide note at all. But he died in a locked room. Not locked, said Whimsy. Merely closed. The door was unlocked when I tried it, though I dare say no one else did between 4 o'clock and 8. Tolland frowned. What about the tea? I'm glad you mentioned that. The housekeeper said she left it at the door. He called out for her to go away. So the tray was never brought inside. Whimsy allowed that to hang in the air. Tolland blinked. But if the tray was outside the room, how did it get in? Exactly, the Reverend paled. You mean someone else put it there? I mean, said Whimsy, that if Dr. Martingale was alone all afternoon, then the tea must have remained untouched. But the cup was used, and the teacup held a faint tang of something stronger than Darjeeling. He left Tolland muttering about chamomile and corruption, and went in search of Dawson again. He found the butler in the pantry, measuring teaspoons with ecclesiastical precision. Dawson, he said, a small detail, if you please. Did anyone besides Mrs. Prestwich go upstairs between tea and dinner yesterday? No, my lord. Except for Miss Sybil, who took up a phonograph record around 5:30. Ah, music therapy. I believe she called it mood management, my lord. And did she linger near Dr. Martingale's room? Dawson hesitated. I did pass her on the way down. She was standing quite still by his door. Listening? I couldn't say, my lord. But you thought it odd. Yes, my lord, and thank you, Dawson. That will do admirably. Whimsy returned to the morning room and stood for some time at the window, looking not at the drizzle-soaked garden but at his own faint reflection in the glass. Behind him the shadows were beginning to draw long, despite the hour. In the great Gothic silence of the house he heard no movement, only the soft clicking of an old clock 2 rooms away, and faintly, the creak of something upstairs. A lamp had flickered on cue. A note had been abandoned mid-thought, and somewhere in East Hatch Grange a woman had waited by a door. He would need to test the chronology. But first, he would have to ask a few more irrelevant questions. About circuits, about footsteps, about tea, because someone in this house had taken great pains to appear uninvolved. And Whimsy, who knew better than most that the devil was a detail man, was now quietly assembling every last one. The following morning brought a leaden, unhurried rain that tapped at the mullioned windows like an impatient creditor. East Hatch Grange bore it with the weary resignation of an ancestral house long accustomed to English weather and English guilt. Lord Peter Whimsy, dressed in a charcoal tweed suit with a carnation in his buttonhole and a copy of the electrical engineer's handbook tucked under one arm, appeared in the breakfast room just as Dawson was laying out the kippers. I hope, he said, pouring himself a modest half-inch of black coffee, that no one will object if I conduct a few experiments with the fuse box later this morning. I promise to restrict any theatrical explosions to the upper floor. Hester Croom looked up from her grapefruit with the expression of a woman who could not decide whether she was being insulted. Must you? Lord Peter, we are still recovering from yesterday's events. Precisely, he said cheerfully. And nothing aids recovery like practical inquiry. Sybil, seated in her usual slump by the window, said nothing. But Whimsy noticed she was already on her second cigarette and had buttered her toast with the mechanical disinterest of a person preparing for autopsy. Only 2 other guests remained. The Reverend Tolland, who picked at his boiled egg as though afraid it might explode, and Major Garnett, Hester's neighbour and frequent bridge partner, who had been fetched the night before to offer calm company and promptly fallen asleep by the fire. Whimsy turned to him now. Major, I wonder if I might impose upon your mechanical instincts. Eh? Of course, of course. Wires, you mean? Dreadful things. Got my fingers singed once rewiring the wireless. Then you're exactly the sort of man I need. Would you care to join me at the fuse board in half an hour? Major Garnett nodded affably and returned to his toast. After breakfast, Whimsy led the way down to the dim recesses of the house where the fuse box, a sprawling, many-armed thing like a mechanical hydra, occupied a small utility cupboard. "Good heavens," said Garnett, surveying the tangle of wires. "This is practically a crime scene in itself." "Possibly both," Whimsy murmured. He examined the panel, running a gloved finger along the labels, many of which had faded into ambiguity. "Now, according to Dawson, the guest room circuit, the one with the escritoire lamp, is on a separate loop from the hall, the dining room and the parlor." "That's fairly common," said Garnett. "Bedrooms wired separately in older houses, especially if they added electric in dribs and drabs, which is precisely what they did here. Tell me, Major, is it possible, hypothetically, that someone could short out a light in one room intentionally without affecting the rest of the circuit?" Garnett scratched his chin. "Wouldn't be easy. Unless they tampered directly with the socket or used some kind of time switch or relay. But it'd need physical access." "I thought so. And if the lamp in the doctor's room went out independently of the rest, then someone was likely inside that room after the main circuit failed." "That's not possible," said Garnett. "You said the door was closed and no one entered between tea and dinner." "Exactly." Whimsy smiled a little and made a note in a small leather book. He left the Major mumbling about "bake light" and returned upstairs. At the top of the main staircase, he paused to listen. The corridor was still. Sunlight had begun to filter wanly through the high window above, catching motes of dust and illuminating the faded pattern in the hall rug. He walked slowly toward Dr. Martingale's room, not to enter it, but to observe its context. There, just opposite the door, stood a narrow console table with a tarnished silver salver and a shallow dish of potpourri. The faint scent of lavender and cloves still hung in the air. A thin thread of something synthetic, paraffin perhaps, mingled beneath it. Next to the table was a window, its ledge wide and just low enough for someone to perch upon discreetly. Whimsy opened it gently. It gave with only the slightest creak. A guest seeking a moment of air or eavesdropping might do so unnoticed from this very spot. He retraced his steps to the stairwell and then back to the small upstairs lounge, where Sybil had taken to spending most of her hours. She looked up as he entered and immediately resumed her default posture of amused disdain. "Suppose you'll be wanting to know what I was doing at 5 o'clock, she said before he'd spoken a word. "How lovely when the dance partners anticipate the steps." "Yes, if it's not an imposition." She crushed her cigarette with some violence. "I was selecting a record for the gramophone. Aunt Hester has an abominable collection, but I found one tolerable piece, Ravel, I think, and took it up to my room. At precisely 5:30. "I'm not a watch." "No, but others are. Dawson mentioned seeing you near the guest room door." She shrugged. "I passed that way." I paused. "I thought I heard something." "What kind of something?" "Voices, low, unclear. Could have been the wireless from downstairs." "There was no wireless playing," Whimsy said gently. She stiffened. "Then I don't know what I heard." "But you didn't knock?" "No." He nodded as though satisfied. "Tell me, what was your opinion of Dr. Martingale's medical skills?" She frowned. "He was competent, conservative, the sort of man who prescribes warm milk and a brisk walk for depression. And did he ever inquire into your mood management techniques?" "He once suggested I try gardening." "Did you?" "Lord, no. I'm not interested in things that thrive on being cut back." "Quite." Whimsy studied her for a long moment. "And if you had to guess who the her in that note referred to?" "I'd guess Hester," she said too quickly. "They always had some strange unspoken history. He used to look at her like he'd once made a terrible mistake." Whimsy gave a quiet sigh and withdrew. Later that day, as the rain finally eased, he took a walk through the gardens, boots squelching slightly on the gravel. He found Dawson by the greenhouse, clipping dead leaves from a row of potted ferns. "Tell me," Whimsy said, inspecting a fern without interest, "was Dr. Martingale ever alone with Mrs. Croom before he died?" "Only briefly," said Dawson. "She went to speak with him just before 4. I saw her come down the corridor, and when she returned, she looked pale. Said nothing. Went straight to her room, did they argue?" "I couldn't hear." Whimsy turned back to the house, the grey facade rising above the hedges like a tired dowager holding her breath. One guest was dead. One had heard voices. One had lied. And somewhere beneath the brittle civility and polished surfaces, there waited a motive born not of money or madness, but of something far less fashionable: regret. The post arrived just after tea, carried in by Dawson on a silver salver with all the dignity of a funeral procession. There was little enough of it. An advertisement for patent liniment, a bill from a bookseller in Bury St. Edmunds, and a single telegram addressed to Lord Peter Wimsey, which he opened with the absent ease of a man who half expected it. He read it, folded it once, then tucked it into the inside pocket of his jacket with a slight pursing of the lips. The only one to notice was Reverend Tolland, who, having appointed himself moral custodian of the household in the wake of death, made a show of polishing his spectacles as though they might reveal something more. "A problem?" he asked. "An answer, actually," Wimsey replied, "though not yet to the question I most want solved. Is it from your people in London?" "My people," Wimsey said with a grin, "rarely send telegrams unless someone is about to be hanged or married. In this case it concerns the former." He made no further explanation, and Tolland, whose curiosity was robust but his backbone less so, did not press the point. After all, Wimsey's investigations always seemed to unfold like a well-composed fugue. Minor phrases, strange intervals, all resolving only at the final cadence. Instead of lingering in the drawing-room with its soft chintz and heavy shadows, Wimsey made his way up once more to the corridor outside Dr. Martingale's room. He stood quite still, gazing at the door, then stepped back and measured with his eyes the distances between the visible elements: the side table with the salver, the nearby wall sconce, the scuffed place on the carpet where someone had once dropped something weighty and sharp, perhaps a boot. These were the things that interested him now, not the dramatic theatre of the death itself. He was joined quietly by Hester Croom. "Lord Peter," she said, her voice thick but composed, "I know you mean well, but it's becoming rather hard to live inside a crime novel." "Indeed, madam, but I fear one must finish the book one has begun. We've reached about chapter 5, I think. That crucial point where red herrings swim thick and fast, but the true scent is just beginning to rise." "You're enjoying this," she said coldly. "I enjoy the truth," Wimsey said, turning to her fully. "And I dislike deaths that try to pass themselves off as inevitabilities. Dr. Martingale did not die of grief or gout. He died suddenly, quietly, in a house where everyone insists they saw nothing, heard nothing, and knew nothing." She was silent. He studied her. "He went to see you yesterday afternoon, did he not?" "Yes, briefly. At your suggestion?" "No, his." He asked for a moment. "I assumed it was medical. And was it?" She hesitated. "Not entirely. He wished to discuss something from our past." Wimsey tilted his head. "Was it about Sybil?" "No, about me." "Then I'll ask plainly, did you love him?" Her composure cracked, just slightly at the corners. "Once, years ago, before my marriage. We were not engaged, but close to it." "And he ended it?" "I ended it," she said. "I married Arthur instead. It seemed safer, wiser. Did he ever forgive you?" "I think he tried. But something in him changed. He became brittle, clinical. When he visited in recent years, it was always as a doctor, never as a man. And yet yesterday he spoke of it. He said he'd made a mistake," she whispered. "That he'd allowed pride to harden into cruelty. He asked me to forgive him. And did you?" So I said I'd think about it. Wimsey inclined his head gently. "Thank you, Mrs. Croom, that was bravely said." She looked at him for a long moment. "You still think one of us poisoned him?" "I think someone caused him to die," said Wimsey. "Whether by poison, pressure, or other means, well, that remains to be untangled." She turned and walked away, the sound of her steps soft against the worn corridor runner. Wimsey stood alone a moment longer, then returned to his room. There he drew out the telegram and opened it again. "To Lord Peter Wimsey, East Hatch Grange, Suffolk, from Inspector Parker. Scotland Yard subject. Martingale, no sign of suicide, notes among papers. Last prescriptions written 2 days ago. No current patients within family. However, strange entry in ledger. EC, observe carefully. No initials match. Post-mortem in preparation, will update." He tapped the paper against his chin. "EC," he murmured. "EC in a doctor's notes could be anything, but might just be East Hatch Croom, or—" He opened his notebook and jotted a quick series of initials. "HC, Hester Croom Mizasi, Sybil Croom DM, Dr. Martingale R. T, Reverend Tolland MG, Major Garnett D, Dawson MP, Mrs. Prestwich none matched." But then, if it weren't someone in the house. He flipped back several pages and reread his notes on the teacup, the placement of the tray, the misbehaving lamp. One detail nagged him now, the window latch. He retrieved his boots once more and made for the garden. The rear wall of the house, as viewed from the herbaceous border, offered a stack of windows in orderly Georgian tiers. The one belonging to Martingale's room, second from the left, top floor, was just low enough to be reached with a ladder. And the garden shed conveniently had such a ladder. Whimsy, with great leisure and no sense of embarrassment, hauled it up and braced it against the brick. Reverend Tolland, emerging from the greenhouse with a pot of slug-mangled lettuce, gawped openly. "I say, are you planning to burgle the murder scene?" "Just confirming an architectural theory," Whimsy called down. He climbed to the window, examined the latch, then smiled thinly. There were faint scratches around the edges, fresh by the look of them, and the sill bore a narrow scuff, too sharp for a boot, too rough for a glove. He descended with the quiet satisfaction of a man who has seen what he needed to. That night, after supper, he made a point of walking the upper corridor in slippers. He stopped beside the console table outside Martingale's door and crouched slightly. There, along the edge of the table's legs, was a fine smear of something chalky and dark, almost black. Candle soot, or possibly graphite. He scraped a fleck into a small envelope and tucked it into his pocket. "Nearly time," he murmured. "All the instruments are tuning." He passed Sybil on his way back to his room. She didn't speak but gave him a look that might have been fear, or defiance, either would do. The curtain was rising. Rain returned during the night with renewed solemnity, soaking the gravel paths and painting the windows with sluggish rivulets. The next morning, East Hatch Grange exhaled a long sigh of damp silence. Breakfast passed in subdued fragments of conversation. No one mentioned the body still upstairs. No one mentioned the word murder. But silence, as Lord Peter Whimsy well knew, could be more revealing than speech. He waited until Dawson had removed the coffee service before rising and announcing, with theatrical casualness, "I think it's time we played a little game." Hester blinked. "What sort of game, Lord Peter?" "Reconstruction," he said, hands tucked into his jacket pockets. "A modest pantomime. We shall reenact the day of Dr. Martingale's demise. Movements, timings, habits. Not for amusement, I assure you, but for illumination." "Do you mean to gather everyone?" Tolland asked, visibly startled. "Indeed. It's important we establish where each of you was between the hours of 4 and 8, the day before yesterday. You may recall, those were the hours during which Dr. Martingale was not technically speaking dead, though he appears to have done very little else." "No one entered his room," Sybil said sharply. "Possibly," said Whimsy, "though not certainly. And even if that were true, someone may have made rather sure he didn't need to leave it either." Half an hour later, the drawing room had the air of a mismatched theatre company waiting for a director who'd lost the script. Whimsy stood before the fireplace, a folded paper in hand, while Dawson distributed chairs like props. The lamp in the corner, newly replaced, hummed faintly. "I'm afraid," Whimsy began, "that I must first cast our lead, Dr. Martingale himself. As he is tragically indisposed, I shall play him. I have, after all, had considerable experience with lifeless expressions. There were a few nervous smiles. I shall begin upstairs at approximately 3:45. According to Mrs. Prestwich, she delivered tea shortly thereafter. Mrs. Croom, you saw the doctor at about the same time?" Hester inclined her head. "Yes, I entered his room around 10 to 4. He asked to speak privately." "For how long?" 10 minutes. 15 at most. Did anyone see you leave?" Dawson nodded from the doorway. "I did, my lord. I was dusting the stair rails. Good man." "And between that and dinner?" "I passed Miss Sybil at 5:25. She was on her way upstairs." "Miss Sybil, do you confirm?" "Yes," she said shortly. "I took a record up to my room." I paused outside his door. "I did not go in. Did you hear anything?" "I told you, voices perhaps, but indistinct," Whimsy made a note. "Reverend, your movements." "I was walking in the south garden around 5. Returned inside at 6. No witnesses?" Tolland flushed. "Only God, I'm afraid." "How unfortunate," Whimsy murmured. He turned to Major Garnett, who had dozed off during the preamble, but roused at the mention of his name. Tea at 4. Nap at 5. Woke up just before dinner. Entirely useless, I'm afraid." "Not at all," Whimsy said. "The alibi of unconsciousness is very fashionable." He turned to Hester again. "And after your conversation with the doctor, I returned to my sitting room. I did not go upstairs again. No visitors?" "No." "Visitors?" "No." Whimsy nodded, then clapped his hands lightly. "Now I propose we repeat the walk from stairwell to guest room. Miss Sybil, would you be so kind as to walk it just as you did at 5:25? She rolled her eyes but complied, standing with exaggerated nonchalance. She strolled from the room and up the staircase, her slippers soundless on the old treads. Whimsy followed a moment later, then halted just outside the guest room, examining the narrow table once more. "Now," he said to the group who had followed up behind him, "observe the placement of this tray." Dawson stepped forward. "That's where I found it, my lord, on the edge of the table." "Precisely. But consider the angle. If Martingale opened his door just wide enough to speak to Mrs. Prestwich, or to push something out, this is where it would land. Neat. No mess. Just so. And the teacup was used?" asked Tolland. "Yes, a small but visible stain inside. The doctor drank something between 4 and 6. But if he never opened the door to anyone, who delivered it?" They were silent. It's also worth noting that when the lamp flickered at dinner, the lamp in this room went out entirely. Different circuit, and yet extinguished. "Sabotage," Garnett muttered. "Not electrical," Whimsy said. "Mechanical. The filament was deliberately broken. That lamp didn't flicker, it died." "But who would go in and—" Tolland began. "Exactly," said Whimsy. "Someone was in this room after 4. They tampered with the lamp. They administered something to the tea, and they ensured the window was relatched from inside so it looked untouched." He crossed to the window and opened it again, gesturing to the scuff on the sill. "This mark," he said, "was left by a ladder. And now, allow me to draw your attention to the telegram I received this morning." He removed it from his jacket. Dr. Martingale's. Records mentioned a patient under initials E.C., whom he noted as requiring careful observation. There is no one in the family with those initials. But as my dear friend Inspector Parker reminded me, Martingale used initials based on aliases when confidentiality was required. He turned to Sybil. "Miss Sybil, your real name is Sybil Eleonora Croom, is it not?" She went dead white. "Martingale had reason to monitor you. He believed you were a danger, to yourself or others. He mentioned it last year in private correspondence to a colleague. He believed you were capable of calculated violence masked as melancholy." Sybil took a step back. "You knew," Whimsy went on softly, "that he was considering action. Committal, perhaps. He had seen something that made him feel responsible. So you acted first." She didn't speak. "You laced the tea. You used the ladder to reach the window. You left the note incomplete, perhaps as a warning or perhaps to confuse. And you broke the lamp filament to suggest the death occurred later than it did." Sybil turned, ran, shoved past Hester on the stairs. But Dawson, solid as a butler should be, was already at the bottom. Whimsy didn't pursue. He folded the telegram and said, "Well, curtain up." And in the sudden quiet of the hall, Hester sat down heavily on the nearest chair and whispered, "I always knew she hated him. I just never thought she'd act on it." The confession, when it came, was not dramatic. Sybil did not scream or rail or collapse in a tangle of limbs and tears. She did not demand a lawyer or fling herself against the walls. Instead, she stood in the small green-walled morning room where she had first spoken to Whimsy, her arms folded and her jaw set as if prepared to argue over a mislaid coat rather than a murder. "I suppose you'll want a written statement," she said, lighting a cigarette with a hand that barely shook. "That would be most helpful," said Whimsy. "Though I confess I'm rather more interested in the why than the how. The method, after all, is mostly a matter of dull logistics. But motive, there's the true art of crime." She laughed once, a brittle, mirthless sound. "You think it was art?" "No, Lord Peter, it was exhaustion. It was years of being observed and judged and corrected by that man. He had no right." "You mean Dr. Martingale?" "I mean Charles," she snapped. "He played the moral custodian of this house. He treated my aunt like a relic to be polished and kept upright. And he treated me like a clinical curiosity. Every look was a diagnosis." "He was concerned," Whimsy said mildly. "He was controlling," she countered. "He didn't approve of my music, my friends, my clothes. He said I was unstable, that I had moods, that I lacked discipline. He said I was dangerous." Whimsy's eyes narrowed slightly. "And were you?" She met his gaze. "Only to him." She dropped into the chair by the fireplace and stared at the ashtray as if it might offer her absolution. Outside, rain traced weak rivulets down the panes. The house, sensing drama completed, had returned to its usual state of bored composure. "You said something when we first spoke," Whimsy said, "about the house smelling of lilies and pipe smoke. I thought at the time it was an idle remark. Now I wonder, was it his scent you meant?" She nodded slowly. He had a pipe. Always that same cloying sweet tobacco. It lingered in the hall long after he'd gone. I started smelling it even when he wasn't there. I'd open a drawer and think he was standing behind me. And the lilies? They were in his room always, Aunt Hester's doing. She thought it softened him. Made him human. Whimsy paced slowly before the hearth. "So you poisoned his tea, what, with a sedative? Something that would make it look peaceful? Something from his own bag," she said. It was almost poetic. A vial marked for severe agitation. I just adjusted the dose. "And you climbed the ladder?" She nodded again. "I waited until everyone was in the garden or napping. I'd seen Dawson put the ladder away before. I knew it would reach. I was careful. The lamp? I broke the filament so it would seem like it failed along with the others. It bought me time. I thought someone might assume it was a heart attack." "You underestimated your audience," Whimsy said. But not unkindly, she didn't reply. There was a long pause, filled only by the sound of a distant clock chiming the half-hour. Finally, she said, "Will there be a trial?" "There will be an inquest," Whimsy replied. "And perhaps more. But you've made a statement, and that matters." "It matters very much," he stood. "I'll leave you now. But I advise you to prepare for a visit from Inspector Parker. He's a good man, methodical, not without sympathy." She gave a strange little smile. "You make it sound almost bearable." "One aims for small mercies," Whimsy said. He left the room and found Dawson waiting in the corridor. "Unobtrusive as ever. Could you see to it that Miss Croom is not disturbed?" he asked. "Of course, my lord. And when you have a moment, Dawson, could you bring me a glass of the Armagnac I noticed in the drawing-room decanter? I feel a distinct need for something that burns politely." Dawson nodded and departed. Whimsy walked slowly through the house. He found Reverend Tolland in the library, half buried in a volume of patristic commentary, his face pale and his eyes unfocused. "Is it true?" Tolland asked without preamble. "What she did?" "Yes," said Whimsy. "It is." The clergyman sighed. "I don't know what to feel. Pity, I suppose, horror. And yet he was not a kind man." "No," said Whimsy, "but he was not an unkind one either. Merely precise. And certainty, when applied without grace, can feel like cruelty." He did not stay long. The house had begun to feel like a theater after closing, props still standing. Echoes of dialogue in the rafters, but the illusion broken. He found Hester Croom in the conservatory, seated beside a weeping fig and a long-dormant lemon tree. She did not rise as he entered. "I knew it," she said quietly, in some deep, cowardly place. I knew she hated him. I let it fester. "You hoped it would pass," Whimsy replied. "Yes, or resolve. I thought perhaps if he apologized, if he acknowledged the damage. He did." She looked up sharply. "He did? The day he died. He said he'd wronged you, that he had hardened, that he wanted forgiveness." Her eyes filled with tears she didn't bother to wipe away. "Then it's worse, somehow. That he was just beginning to mend and she chose then." Whimsy said nothing. There was nothing to say. He walked once more through the quiet house, pausing only to look into Martingale's room one final time. The window was shut now, the lamp replaced, the desk cleared. Only the faint shadow of a stain on the carpet remained. As he turned away, Dawson appeared with the Armagnac. "Thank you," Whimsy said, accepting the glass. "So you've been admirably steady, Dawson." "One tries, my lord." Whimsy raised the glass in a quiet salute. "To steadiness, then." He sipped, grimaced slightly at the fire of it, and stared into the middle distance. One death, one confession, and a house full of silence. He would write to Parker tonight. The machinery of justice would roll forward. And he, as ever, would step aside, because Lord Peter Whimsy never really caught murderers. He simply watched as the truth assembled itself, piece by piece, until it became too solid to ignore. By the following afternoon, the rain had relented at last, retreating into a mist so fine it barely troubled the windows. The lawns glistened dully, and the rose beds looked bruised as if still smarting from some invisible blow. Easthatch Grange had returned to the rhythms of imposed civility. Tea was served, mail was fetched, and Dawson went about his duties with the austere grace of a man employed above the emotional temperature of his surroundings. Lord Peter Wimsey sat in the library, leafing through the late Dr. Martingale's small travelling valise, which Inspector Parker had finally authorised him to examine in detail. Parker himself was due on the 5:40 train from London, and Wimsey had promised to hold the fort until his arrival. He'd sent word with the gardener's boy that the confession, already written and signed, would be ready for formal transfer of custody. But confessions, he knew, however complete, rarely told the whole truth. He opened the valise carefully. Inside were the expected items: a small leather-bound journal, blank but for 2 short entries, a sheaf of prescription forms, 2 sealed vials labelled only by hand, 1 anx and 2 stimul, and a folded letter, clearly once read many times, its creases sharp and fingerprints faintly visible in the lamplight. Wimsey read it once. In silence, it was from Hester Croom. Written 3 years prior and unsigned, it began formally, as if she'd first intended it as nothing more than a thank-you note. But by the second paragraph, the tone had shifted. It was the letter of a woman unsatisfied with her choices, addressing a man she once knew more intimately than she cared to admit. You are a doctor, and perhaps that blinds you. You treat every soul like an infection to be contained. But I am not diseased, I am simply tired. I chose stability over feeling. I chose cold safety over dangerous love. And I have never forgiven you for letting me do it so easily. Wimsey folded the letter and slid it back into the valise. The more he turned it over, the more he realized that the murder had not been committed out of hatred alone. There was love tangled in it, misshapen, spoiled by years of disappointment and observation. Dr. Martingale had not merely judged Sybil, he had tried to save her. But he had failed to see what that salvation looked like to her. He stood, stretched, and walked down the corridor, passing Sybil's door without slowing. She was under the nominal supervision of Hester now, though Wimsey suspected that no more supervision would be necessary. She had confessed with the finality of someone who had waited years for the moment to arrive. The fury had burned through and left her hollow. There would be no escape attempt, no protest. Only the slow administrative trudge of justice. In the conservatory, he found Hester once more, this time attending to the lemon tree with a pair of small shears. She cut a single dead leaf from a curling stalk and dropped it with exaggerated precision into the waiting bowl beside her. She looked up at his approach. "It's almost funny," she said. "You go about your life trying to maintain order, to keep everything trimmed and contained. And then one dead root spoils the entire plant." "Ah," Wimsey said, "but sometimes it isn't the root that's dead. Sometimes it's the soil that's poisoned." She smiled thinly. "Was I the poison, Lord Peter?" He considered her. "No, but you were the silence. And silence, as we've seen, can be as dangerous as malice." She nodded slowly but said nothing more. Wimsey let her be. He returned to the drawing-room where the fire had been lit, more for atmosphere than warmth, and poured himself a measure of the Armagnac once more. The drink had acquired symbolic significance in his mind, something constant, amid the ambiguity of human intent. Major Garnett entered some minutes later, looking slightly more alert than usual. "Wimsey, I must say I still don't quite believe it. Miss Sybil, of all people. I thought she was just one of those bored modern girls. What do they call it? Neurasthenia?" "That's not far off," said Wimsey, watching the flames. "But neurasthenia doesn't generally involve tampering with light fittings and administering fatal dosages." "No, indeed. Dashed clever, that bit with the lamp." "She planned it with care," Wimsey agreed. "The ladder, the timing, the use of Martingale's own medicines, it had a grim sort of elegance. She didn't want to make it look like murder. She wanted it to look like inevitability. Isn't that the same thing sometimes?" Wimsey looked up. "Yes, that's what makes it such an interesting case." There was a pause. "I suppose she'll be sent away," Garnett muttered. "Prison, or what's the other place?" "Somewhere with locks," Wimsey said. "But not for punishment." "For prevention." Garnett harumphed, then left, clearly unsatisfied with such moral untidiness. At precisely 5:45, the front bell rang. Dawson, punctual as ever, opened the door to admit Inspector Parker, tall and rain-spattered, with a briefcase in one hand and the air of a man who had braved British Rail for the sake of duty. "Peter," he said. Removing his hat, "Charles," said Whimsy. "You're just in time for the denouement. The cast has confessed, the curtain's fallen, and the audience is shuffling toward the exits, wondering whether to applaud." Parker smiled faintly. "Where's the suspect?" "In her room. Not under guard, but not inclined to bolt. She signed the statement. You'll find it upstairs." Parker nodded and made for the staircase. Whimsy followed him only as far as the foot of the stairs, then turned and went to the window. Outside, the light was thinning. The sky was the color of old linen, and the trees, soaked and drooping, swayed as if remembering something unpleasant. Behind him, the great house creaked softly. Somewhere a door shut. A kettle began to whistle. There would be reports to sign, a few discreet notices in the Times, perhaps even a short piece in one of the seedier crime papers. Doctor's death masks hidden resentments in Suffolk estate. They would get the names slightly wrong, and the timings askew, and none of them would understand the silence at the heart of it. Whimsy reached for his glass and lifted it one last time. "To misunderstandings," he murmured, "and to all the tidy lives ruined by good intentions." He drank, and the fire crackled, and outside Easthatch Grange, the world went on as if nothing had happened. Inspector Charles Parker was a patient man, but not a sentimental one. When he emerged from his interview with Sybil Croom an hour later, his face bore the faint expression of someone who had just leafed through a disturbing book, absorbed, unsettled, and faintly irritated at how difficult it would be to explain to others. He found Lord Peter Whimsy in the library, now surrounded by a small cairn of Martingale's personal effects, books, vials, a bundle of tightly folded monographs, and sipping a lukewarm cup of tea that Dawson had insisted on bringing for proper appearance. "Well?" Whimsy asked, not looking up from the page he was pretending to read. Parker dropped into the armchair opposite. "She's lucid, calm, answered every question, made no attempt to soften the truth or redirect blame." "Yes," said Whimsy. "I found her almost apologetic. Not for the murder itself, mind you, only for the mess it left behind." "She said that?" Parker asked, eyebrows lifting. "No, she said nothing of the kind. But it's there in the tone." Parker rubbed his forehead. "You know I've dealt with all sorts. Jealous wives, violent brothers, clever poisoners. But this girl, it's not insanity, Peter. Not by the books. She's sharp, cold, but not disordered." Whimsy shut the book gently. "There's a kind of cruelty that grows not from malice, but from self-preservation. Sybil believed, correctly or not, that Martingale would have her locked away, slowly erased from the life she had left. She struck first not out of glee but grim necessity." Parker said nothing for a moment. Then, "She's right about one thing." "Oh? About one thing, oh?" She wouldn't have lasted long in an institution, not with him overseeing it. He'd have called it concern, but it would have been a slow, relentless burial. Paperwork, silence, and sedation. "That's the tragedy," said Whimsy quietly. "Martingale had grown too used to power that wears the mask of care." Parker looked away. "Still, she killed him." "Yes, no second thoughts." "She climbed a ladder, tampered with a lamp, used his own medicine against him. I dare say the Crown will have little trouble making its case." Parker let out a long breath. "I'll take her in tomorrow quietly, no spectacle." "Good." They lapsed into silence. Outside, the mist had thickened once more. The great house stood cloaked in it, like something trying to remember its own outline. Parker rose and walked to the fireplace, examining a photograph on the mantel, Hester and Arthur Croom framed in stiff Edwardian silver. A dog sat at their feet, long dead, one presumed. "She knew about the letter," Parker said suddenly. "Which letter?" "The one from Hester to Martingale." She saw him reading it once. "Said he kept it in a book. Euripides, I think." "Ah," said Whimsy. "That explains his peculiar mood. Perhaps he came to make peace, not pronouncements. And perhaps," said Parker, "he thought he could rescue them both." Whimsy glanced at the window. A doctor, a romantic, and a man who trusted silence. A fatal mix. The day wore on. Preparations were made. Parker telephoned his superiors and arranged for discreet transport. Dawson packed a small case with Sybil's clothing, done with the impeccable efficiency of a man who does not pass judgment but ensures that appearances remain intact. That evening, after a spare supper during which no one spoke more than absolutely required, Whimsy stepped out into the garden for air. The fog had turned the grounds into something half theatrical. Hedges loomed like walls, trees disappeared into the white. The air smelled of damp stone and turned soil. He wandered toward the rear of the house, his boots sinking slightly in the wet ground. There, beneath the guest room window, stood the ladder. Dawson had returned it to its usual place by the shed, but it had been used again, this time by Parker, to confirm the scuff marks and examine the window from outside. Whimsy stared at it now, its silent wooden rungs catching dew. So simple, he murmured, so deliberate. Behind him, the sound of footsteps. He turned to find Hester approaching, her coat thrown over her shoulders, face pale beneath her usual composure. "She's sleeping," she said. "Or pretending to." "Good," Whimsy said. "She'll need strength." They stood for a while in silence. "Do you think she hated him?" Hester asked softly. "Truly? I think she resented him, feared him, perhaps even admired him. But hatred? I don't know. She killed him because she believed it was the only way left to breathe. That's not quite hatred. It's survival. Brutal but recognizable." Hester folded her arms. "I tried to protect her." "You did," Whimsy said. "But protection requires knowledge." And she told no one what she felt. Not clearly. Not until it was too late. "I was afraid of her sometimes," she whispered. "Yes," said Whimsy. "So was he." The fog thickened around them. After a long pause, Hester said, "Will you stay until tomorrow?" "Yes, thank you." She turned and walked back toward the house, disappearing into the grey like a figure retreating into a dream. Whimsy remained behind, staring once more at the ladder. He thought of Sybil's face as she'd looked while confessing, composed, grim, not quite defiant. He thought of Martingale, slumped over his desk, the final sentence unfinished, not because he had run out of words, but because he had run out of time. And he thought of all the silences that had festered in Easthatch Grange, polite silences, familial silences, the kind that rot under varnish. He turned and followed Hester's path. Tomorrow, the train would come. Inspector Parker would return to London. The law would resume its steady pace. The newspapers would get it half right, and the Grange would grow quiet again. But Lord Peter Wimsey knew that no house where such silence had lived would ever be quite still again. The next morning dawned with a hard, indifferent light. The fog had lifted, and in its place came a brittle, cloudless chill that made the windows shine like brittle porcelain and turned the gravel drives to glass. Easthatch Grange looked momentarily sharp and unreal in the clear morning, as if it had been repainted in harsh contrast overnight. Lord Peter Wimsey stood at the edge of the drive, his coat collar turned up against the cold, and watched as the police car, a modest Wolseley saloon sent by Parker's Suffolk liaison, turned onto the approach. The tyres crunched over the frost-hardened path with almost theatrical solemnity. Behind him, the house remained as it had been for generations, upright, civilized, and deeply reluctant to admit its recent unpleasantness. Wimsey did not look back at the door. He heard it open, heard Dawson's gentle voice announcing the vehicle's arrival. He heard Sybil Croom's footsteps descending the stairs, unhurried even. When she emerged, her head was bare, her coat buttoned to the throat and her expression unreadable. There was no trace of either pride or regret in her bearing. She looked, Wimsey thought, like someone preparing to meet an exam invigilator. "Miss Croom," said Inspector Parker, stepping forward with professional gravity. "Thank you for your cooperation." Sybil gave the faintest nod. "I have a statement in my bag. I wrote it after you left last night. There are a few things I forgot the first time. We'll take it at the station," Parker said gently. Wimsey stepped forward. "May I walk with you as far as the car?" She looked at him surprised but did not refuse. They moved together down the final stretch of gravel toward the waiting vehicle. "It won't be quick," he said softly. "Trials never are. I don't mind." "Sybil," he asked, and for the first time he used her name without title or distance. "Was there a moment when you might have turned back? When you could have stopped?" She paused just for a moment before answering. "Yes," she said. "When I climbed the ladder, and I saw his face in the lamplight. He was writing." "Just that, writing," Wimsey nodded. "He wasn't expecting you to kill him." "No, he was expecting me to forgive him, and you couldn't." "I didn't trust it," she said. "He always thought an apology wiped the slate clean. But I'd lived with the marks too long. I couldn't let him start again. Not when I couldn't." They reached the car. Wimsey opened the door for her and she stepped in without hesitation. The constable in the front nodded respectfully. Parker closed the door, gave Whimsy a brief look of professional finality, then joined her inside. The vehicle started with a soft grumble and moved off, leaving the frost-crusted gravel behind. Whimsy remained still until it had passed beyond the hedges and disappeared into the lane. Then he turned back toward the house. Dawson was waiting at the door, offering a coat-brushing gesture that was both symbolic and literal. Whimsy allowed it. "Breakfast, my lord?" "God, yes." He entered the dining room to find Hester already seated, her back straight and her hands neatly folded beside a plate of untouched toast. The windows here looked out over the garden. The one where the ladder had stood, now gone, returned to its shed as if nothing had happened. Nothing had happened. "She's gone, then," Hester said. "Yes, did she say anything?" "Not much, enough." She closed her eyes briefly. "I thought I could protect her. I thought perhaps by keeping things quiet, by smoothing over the little disasters, I could help her survive." "You kept the wrong silence," said Whimsy. "The kind that grows teeth." "I know." Dawson arrived with the coffee pot. He poured without comment and withdrew. "I'm thinking of selling the house," Hester said suddenly. Whimsy raised an eyebrow. "Oh?" "Too many rooms," she said. "Too many memories. Too many windows that look out and only ever reflect inwards. It's a handsome place," he said. "It was never a happy one." They drank their coffee in quiet agreement. Later that morning, Whimsy gathered his things. The valise packed, the notebooks closed, the facts arranged and catalogued. Parker would file the official report by Thursday. The newspapers would give it a day or two in print. Doctor dies in country house, local woman detained, before moving on to more titillating stories. But this one, Whimsy knew, would linger in the corners of his mind. Not because of the method, though it had been clever. Not because of the scene, though it had been grimly picturesque. No, it would stay with him because it had been so human. It had been, in the end, about misunderstandings that calcified into grievances, about the kind of loneliness one only experiences when surrounded by others. He said his goodbyes to Hester at the door. She offered him her hand, cool and steady, the hand of someone who had decided to survive even if she didn't deserve to. "I suppose," she said, "you'll have another case soon." "Undoubtedly," Whimsy said. "There's always another tangle to unpick, and you'll solve it with words and logic and wry little comments." "I do try. But does it ever wear on you?" she asked. Whimsy smiled. "Only when it stops being a puzzle and starts being a tragedy. And this one?" "This one," he said quietly, "was both." He stepped into the waiting cab, the driver nodding without question, and they rolled away down the long drive. As they turned the corner past the garden, Whimsy looked back one last time at East Hatch Grange. The house stood in the sunlight, composed and clean-edged, the gravel shining, the curtains drawn, the windows blank. It looked, as it always had, like a place where nothing very remarkable could ever happen, and yet, as the cab turned the final bend, Lord Peter Whimsy removed a small object from his pocket, a scrap of paper, once folded, now smoothed flat. The final sentence of Martingale's note. He had taken it after Parker had made his copy. I should have stopped her. But he folded it once more, very carefully, and tucked it into the inside of his jacket. Some unfinished sentences, he thought, were best left that way. The road ahead was clear, and somewhere a bell chimed noon. 2 weeks later, the last frost had receded from the hedgerows, and London was beginning, uncertainly, to smell of crocuses and coal smoke. Lord Peter Whimsy stood at the broad windows of his Piccadilly flat, staring down at the murmuring traffic with a glass of Tokay in one hand and a half-read telegram in the other. He had returned from Suffolk 2 days prior and thrown himself, with no great conviction, into his usual distractions, cataloguing rare monographs, playing a few ragged bars of Bach on the piano, and composing a poem about an alibi that rhymed Qatar with Samarkand. But the case had lingered, refusing to settle neatly into the filing cabinet of memory. Across the room, Inspector Charles Parker let out a sigh and folded the Times onto his knee. "She'll be sent to Broadmoor," he said. "Unfit to stand trial. Medical testimony unanimous." "Yes," said Whimsy. "They're calling it a mental health tragedy." The Mail ran a column about the dangers of overeducated young women. Whimsy made a small sound. "I dare say next week they'll warn against pianos and Shelley." Parker reached for his tea. And Martingale? Whimsy turned slowly. He went to Easthatch intending to make peace. He knew he had failed Sybil, failed her not through malice but through an excess of certainty. He believed she could be redirected, corrected, made safe. What he did not see was that she had already decided what safe meant to her. Parker nodded. And Hester? She remains. Sorting letters, cataloguing heirlooms, consulting discreet estate agents. I don't think she'll remain there long. And you? Whimsy smiled faintly. I've already remained too long. He set the telegram down on the table. It bore the signature of one Miss Catherine Climpson, his occasional assistant, reporting that the handwriting in Martingale's final note matched none of his known patients. It was his own through and through, so, Parker said. He meant to write, I should have stopped her, but I didn't. Or perhaps, but I loved her. Or perhaps, Whimsy replied, he wasn't sure what he meant. He was a man halfway between control and regret. That's a dangerous place to linger. He crossed to the fire and dropped the telegram into it. The paper curled, flared, and was gone. You're not keeping the note? Parker asked. I kept the conclusion, Whimsy said. I no longer need the sentence. They spoke little after that. Parker departed with his usual briskness, promising to phone if anything else turned up, and Whimsy, alone once more, returned to the window. A man in a bowler hat was hailing a cab. A girl in a blue coat crossed the street, with her head bent against the wind. Nothing unusual, nothing tragic, nothing of note. And yet he thought again of Easthatch Grange, of the creaking stair, the scraped window ledge, the smell of lilies and cold light, of a house full of secrets and a murder born not of hatred, but of accumulation, silence, expectation, control, and finally the desperate need to reclaim a life no longer one's own. He did not excuse Sybil, but he understood her. And that he knew was the burden of his work, not justice, not punishment, but understanding. The slow, persistent effort to see clearly what others had chosen not to. He poured himself another glass and raised it, not in triumph nor in sorrow, but in recognition. To the unfinished, he said softly. And the things we almost said. And then he turned from the window, lit a cigarette, and vanished into the waiting evening. Tools ChatGPT can make mistakes. Check important info.